pleasure being here today and talking about one of my personal favorite topics, which is evolution. Evolution is what has defined many industries in the last few years. We've seen tremendous things happening in terms of the content evolving over time, in terms of steps having been taken in order to improve upon what already was a very, very good and solid baseline. Nonetheless, let me start by saying a couple of words about myself so that we can also have a solid background. I've been in this industry for closing in on 15 years. And within these 15 years, what I've been witnessing all along and constantly is the fact that there is a push towards more content being created, massively more over time, and a need, a necessity to handle this content from all possible angles in a much more efficient and streamlined way. What we're going to do today is we're going to talk about those specific aspects. We're going to talk about global communication and how we can define a balance therein. DITA specifically, and how it has evolved and practically has defined with its evolution the evolution of other industries, of other content types. And then we're going to go into the details around how this whole thing ties in together with what has happened in the localization industry and specifically with XTM as a translation management system. Not only to the degree of automation, of improvement of processes, but also to the degree of that allowing the individual users, the individual people working within localization, to enhance their ability to deliver content better. I'd like to start by saying a couple of things around the industry itself, if you're not familiar with it especially. So there's two very specific sayings within our industry that make a reappearance every now and then and are becoming buzzwords. The first is streamlining. And while streamlining is a very, very specific word that everybody is familiar with, within the localization industry, it carries a bit of a different meaning. Streamlining for us doesn't necessarily mean streamlining the localization processes alone, but by extension, it means that we need to streamline based on how the content source has streamlined. In effect, we adopt content creation, content management defines the process, defines how we should streamline. And then we in the localization, being the recipients of that content, adapt to whatever is happening on the content side. So if the content is evolving in a positive direction, a structured direction, so must we in localization move in that same direction. The second saying is one of the oldest sayings within this industry and has been around before I even started myself, which is garbage in and garbage out. In effect, what this means is that we are the recipients of content, and whatever that content is what we can also produce. So the quality of the content that is received for localization is the quality of the content we can also output. If that content is garbage, the best we can deliver is garbage. Translatable quality will never, ever be superior to the original quality. At best, it can match it. So garbage in, garbage out is something that will be heard quite a bit today, among other things that I will be talking about. I don't think it's a surprise to anybody in any possible way that there is a massive amount of data, of information being produced in the world. We have an insurmountable and unprecedented amount of different sources of content, user-created, company-created, structured, unstructured, out there in the world that is being produced on a daily basis. Even every second, there's millions of data points being created. All this has to, a degree at least, move into a localization stream. And as we can understand, it is becoming all the more complex to adopt and maintain proper processes and deliver those quality high results we're looking for, because all these sources are not necessarily quality high. In this chaos, amidst this chaos, there is a bit of a glimmer of hope, though, something that we've seen happening and that we've seen being more and more adopted, which is structured content. Structured content, and specifically DITA, of course, in this case, apart from being a tremendous achievement in terms of the content curating and the content creation and the content management, also has that ripple effect to localization. We go from a mode of hundreds of individual files from random sources with random content, with random quality being dumped for localization, with questionable results stemming on the other side, to a mode where we produce and effectively receive structured, curated content that goes away from that jumbled messaging that you have to process on a daily basis. Now, this evolution that we've seen over the last 10, 15, maybe even more years has been side by side. Content and content management has been the pioneer. It has defined the evolution because of the necessity to do so in order to be able to handle the masses of data that I mentioned before, the masses of information. But at the same time, because localization is a true necessity, it is a requirement for the vast majority of content being created, especially for companies that attempt to go global, it is an inevitable reality that localization itself has to evolve side by side to technical writing, to technical authoring. If the one becomes agile, the other has to become agile. If the one becomes structured, the other has to become structured. If not, then the whole thing breaks apart. By extension, the process is followed, right? So content is created, content is localized. If content is created in a good way, in a proper way, in an agile way, if you may, and then the localization doesn't follow the same principle, it creates a bottleneck. It creates a problem. It is a threat to whatever has been achieved on the content side. As such, the evolution had to be done side by side. The evolution had to be something that is, I would say, mutually followed so that the results can be of equal level to both the source and the target. By controlling your source, you preserve your brand values. It is a very specific statement, and of course, it holds true if you look purely at the content side, that by controlling your assets, you preserve your brand values in that original language. However, and with everything that I've said so far, this holds true also to the world of translation, to the world of localization. Controlling those assets, structuring them, transfers the meaning to also the localized content. So the brand will not only be preserved in the source and be, I would say, unified and harmonized, but that will also be true for any localized variant produced out of the translation process. Now, of course, we know DITA and its strengths, and by going in the direction of structuring this content and adopting a structured content principle and methodology, intra-company communication has been maintained. It's unified. So what would be previously, and that is actually very, very true, a decentralized approach from various departments within a company to tackling their necessity to translate content, and each of them approaching in a bit of a different way, we now moved into the mode whereby centralizing it under the same roof with structured means that the unified message is maintained and is empowered across all the different content streams produced by an organization. And while this might not be necessarily something that resonates with everyone right away, I can tell you here that by experience, one of the biggest hurdles companies see as they are evolving in a global world is the fact that they take different routes, different approaches for each of their content streams, for each of their departments, potentially each of their business units, because there are differences in how they are structured, how they're organized. By result, a few years later, down the road, there comes a realization that that has been a mistake. The mistake comes from the fact that each of them approaching it differently from content creation to content localization also gets different results. There is disharmony in the content. There is ambiguity in the content, both in the source and in the target variants being produced. And that, of course, is problematic by definition and does require a cleanup act in order to be improved and maintained. While I would, and many can argue actually for that matter, that content writers, content creators are not part of the localization process. They are not truly involved in localization itself. They are, however, one of the most vital links in that chain of events. As I mentioned before, and I'm going to use the same verbiage now, garbage in, garbage out. Simply here, if from the documentation side, the content is already of poor and low quality, inevitably you will have the same in the translated variants. This means that not only is it important that the source is being maintained, as we mentioned before, but it also effectively means that it becomes a vital part of the process. Hence, I mentioned also the streamlining notion earlier, which within our industry means that we streamline based on how the source has streamlined. They are key contributors. If you are working in technical communication, in technical authoring, and documentation architecture, you are a vital part of localization throughout the process, because the source is always what defines the results of this endeavor. We have come a long way, right? As I mentioned before, the evolution has been continuous. And DITA is one of these formats that has allowed for this evolution to bring also innovation. Now, many years ago, and if you look back in the past, you would have certain situations, certain conditions being met where you would get a huge dump of unrelated files to translate, or even worse, related files that, however, had no distinct, visible, tangible relation between them. Random file namings, random file extensions, random file formats, all convoluted and being dumped onto a translator or a linguist to attempt to produce the best possible quality. With the structure that DITA has introduced to the source, what by extension happens and occurs is that the content that is submitted to XTM Cloud is properly mapped, identified, and exposed to the linguist in such a way that they can understand exactly what they're translating. And while this might again not be something that you're necessarily familiar with, you always have to remember that translators, linguists, do need context. They need to understand what they're actually working on in order to better to produce the best possible results. So the first thing here is that upon submitting the content, the DITA content to XTM, regardless of how many files we're looking at, small or large, you can leverage one of the core functionalities and technologies here, which is that we effectively join those files in a way that we produce a sensible, tangible, and accessible result to the translator. And that makes a huge difference to their productivity, their efficiency, and their potential quality output. As said, you have hundreds, maybe even thousands smaller fragments of a DITA file or smaller DITA files coming together to produce your DITA map. The linguist, however, will not be exposed to that complexity. That is a complexity which is needed in order to, of course, maintain the content in the source and make the most out of it, reuse content blocks continually, and be able to update items on the fly. When it, however, goes to the translator, that person will be overwhelmed by the masses of information. They are not trained and they are not experts in handling massive content, especially when we're talking about hundreds and thousands of different files coming their way. For them, that is a bottleneck. For them, that is a problematic area when translating. simplicity is key, and that respects their need to be focusing on what matters, which is to translate content and produce quality high output. By this file joining that we mentioned before, by this effectively single DITA file for translation, as we would like to call it, the linguist is catered to. The translator now has the means, or rather has been removed from an unnecessary workflow or steps that they needed to perform before. Nonetheless, you can still hire multiple linguists. We can split the files subsequently to the process of dumping them to XTM cloud in this case. So there's many things that you can still do, but the baseline should always be that regardless of the complexity of the source, depending on how many files you have and such, that the linguist receives a simple output that they can process. The next thing that is more than vital and has proven to be a cornerstone in the evolution of translation management systems and translators themselves in terms of productivity and efficiency is visual mode. The general idea of translating a DITA file as is, without being able to visually understand it or see it in context, has been a continuous struggle. Imagine a translator opening a DITA file that contains one single sentence, which is part of a larger manual, some sort of technical document. And they have literally, at that point in time, no idea where that text appears, under which conditions, what it references, if there is an image, a graphic associated with it. So to a large extent, their eyes are closed. They need to blindly attempt to translate what they're seeing there and use their best judgment to produce a translation. The truth, however, is that due to ambiguity in language, that can easily create incorrect translations. And by extension, this creates unnecessary processes. This creates unnecessary problematic areas within the content stream, within the content flow. A linguist translates with eyes closed, in this case. Content is pushed back to the content source. And accordingly, during that process of rendering or publication, errors are potentially identified that have to go back to the linguist, and an extensive process of arbitration, proofreading, and potentially fine-tuning and polishing happens post-publication, post-return of content to the content source. On the flip side, though, what we do with XTM is we take this process, this visual rendering of the actual files upstream. We enable linguists to not only join the files, as I said before, when we're talking about a large array of data files, and see them properly and in order and understand where everything is at. But we also extend that capability one step further, which is by allowing them to visually preview and see how the content will be rendered directly within the translation environment. So instead of going and creating more process steps, many of them occurring post delivery of the content back to the content source, we take this entire process upstream and we allow the linguist or linguists to perform a visual recognition of the file as they are translating the content. This all, however, in a very, very, very agile world, is only covering part or addressing part of the problematic areas. I mentioned again the keyword before of streamlining, and inevitably streamlining the process of localization, of structured content, of data, is not possible unless the content management system, the content source, and the translation management system talk to each other. And by that, I mean deep, direct handshakes that enable these systems to effectively communicate. We produce massive, massive volumes of content. Somebody has to manage that. Somebody has to push it from one system to the other. Somebody has to manage it in both systems. If we move away from that definition, what is definitely feasible here, and that's what we have achieved with XTM Cloud, is to allow the content source to submit the content directly to the translation management system, automatically even, or by user selection, and then effectively, once the content is translated in the TMS, in the translation management system, to push it back to the content source without actual human intervention. This connector that we have in place with Adobe Experience Manager ensures that seamless, automated flow between the two systems. Streamlining has never been more approachable as a concept, rather than now that these technologies are in place. And we will tie it all in together at the end of this presentation. Connectors, and this specific connector that we have in place for Adobe Experience Manager, fundamentally changes the way that these two interact with one another. It fundamentally changes and shifts the attention from micromanaging files and clicking buttons and transferring files back and forth to where it actually matters. This is the result of this. The ability to control this deep handshake, your translation management system from within Adobe Experience Manager, is the shift of the paradigm. You don't need to operate in multiple systems to manage the content. It should actually all happen in the content source. And with the connector that we have in place at the moment, that becomes reality. You manage your content, and as you're managing that content, you are enabled from within Adobe Experience Manager to submit it for translation to XTM without even having to open XTM Cloud. Everything is fully automated. The content will be submitted to XTM. XTM will accordingly process it, analyze it, parse it, provide metrics, assign users, enable them to translate within the same environment, join the files as required and as it sees fit for the purpose so that users can get a true, proper experience. And on top of that, also visually render the file for them as being seen here, so that not only they have been empowered to work in a cloud-based solution that simplifies their daily interactions with the translation tool, but they also can take one of the difficult and, as I said before, post-publication processes of proofreading, of improving upon that, upstream and merge it with the actual act of translation. Once this process is done, you as the content manager, as the content owner, receive the result, and you know that the translator has seen this result in context. The translator understands fully what they have been translating and delivers a result that respects not only the linguistic requirements therein, because that's also, of course, a major milestone and major point of importance, but they also fully understand and respect the layout, the structure that you were aiming for, and produced it and maintain it in the target language. It is, of course, one of the major items that have been surfaced in our industry in the last few years, that is continuous localization. This connectivity that I just mentioned that we have been able to establish allows for a fully continuous agile process to be established. You maintain or curate your content in an agile way. You want to be only updating certain content blocks, parts of the entire content that you have created. And you don't want to submit this whole result all the time back for translation. Your goal is to minimize the effort on the source, but of course minimize them in the translation as well. You take the small bit of content that you've updated, and only that small bit of content goes for translation, comes back, and gets merged where it needs to fit in. By allowing these linguists to reduce the noise that they had to work with, reduce the noise of having to figure out what they're actually translating, reduce the noise of having to perform more workflow steps and be involved in various steps of the process, various parts of the process, before publication, after publication. We actually achieve something indirectly that is often not acknowledged, which is setting talent free. You have to always remember that translators, linguists are creative people. They perform an art. Translation is actually a very, very ancient craft that has been able to unite worlds or achieve or allow communication across spoken and written languages since the dawn of time. There's talent, and that talent is something you want to tap into. If linguists work through noisy or within noisy environments, they are not allowed to bring that talent to the table. They're not allowed to take the time to fully understand the text and produce extremely quality, high content in the target. They are forced to work with constraints, and those constraints undermine their ability to deliver quality, high content continually. And we believe strongly that this is a huge turning point of evolution within the industry as well. For the last decade or more, translators have been measured by productivity on a per word per day basis. And this still holds true. This hasn't changed. And of course, that is also how these people, predominantly freelancers, are being paid. This is how they generate revenue. But by maintaining that productivity and at the same time being able to produce better content because there's more time to focus on the essence, on what matters, is a huge evolutionary point within our industry that we're now seeing evolve or unfold before us. And this is also extends, of course, to all the participants of the project. Linguist is, of course, the cornerstone. They are the actual people performing that act of translating. But there's so many people involved in localization nowadays that translators alone are, of course, not enough in order to make a difference. We have project managers, content managers, documentation architects, content creators, content curators, engineers, goes on and on the list. So it would suffice to say here, from the localization to DITA, thank you. A strong thank you for taking that direction, for enabling us to also tap into this, follow the trend, streamline together and evolve side by side. Because now we focus on what matters. Every participant in the project has a purpose. We moved away from noisy, repetitive tasks, and now we have a tool, a system, a medium that actually makes life good. This seamless integration that we mentioned before, this connector that we have established, is not just a connector that allows for content to move from one system to another. Right? We mentioned that before, but perhaps as a repetition here, these two systems, AEM and XTM Cloud, seem to be made for each other. Our evolution from the XTM Cloud side has been such that it followed AEM closely, and it followed DITA, of course, closely. And the seamless integration that we actually have been able to create, to establish, has fundamentally evolved how we can approach this content, and has led us to the conclusion that these systems are made for each other. It works, and it does bring the results that you will be looking for. Mentioned that before, and I think it's one of the key elements of the streamlining. Hence, I would also like to emphasize on this one more time. Management, or file management within the TMS is not something that linguists have to perform. It was done by them, by extension and by necessity, but it shouldn't be the case. Linguists should focus on what matters. Project managers should focus on what matters. And by that ability to structure the DITA map and manage it and merge it and mapping the localization success, we have come to the next level of evolution in localization of structured content. This is an instant process, something I haven't emphasized on just yet. The moment that Adobe Experience Manager will submit the DITA content to XTM, it is immediately analyzed, joined, visually rendered and represented to the linguist, the project managers, or whoever is involved. And that effectively means that apart from everything that we mentioned so far in terms of quality improvements, in terms of streamlining, we become faster, we become more accurate, and we become decisive. We can effectively maintain all the different voices in the content source and transfer those as a single front to the target. These thousands of voices represent these thousands of different DITA files that could potentially be part of a larger project, a larger document. All these would be handled individually in the past. That's no longer the case. With our technology, with our integration, they come together, and regardless of who produced each individual file, how it was inserted to the whole, it becomes part of a single voice that is meant to be translated and transferred to the target audience, to the target locale. We will keep on evolving. We have reached a strong point. We have reached the current pinnacle of evolution, but that's not the end. Anybody who would claim at this point that we cannot improve further, that we cannot evolve further, would actually be probably lying. Evolution is continuous, we all know that. And especially in the context of DITA and localization, there's still so much that can be done. We have integrations, we have deep connectors, direct connectors between the systems. We have respect for the complexity of the structure that is necessary many times. We understand the need to visually render the content for the linguists, but there's definitely more that we can achieve. Over the next few years, as has been the paradigm up until now, as DITA evolves, we will continue evolving with it. As DITA introduces new concepts to the structured content world, the localization world will follow. The pioneer will introduce, and streamlining will be achieved on both ends. To maintain the brand value in all languages, you need to remember two things that I mentioned at the beginning. Garbage in, garbage out, and streamlining. Streamlining by extension in the localization industry. By considering those when you produce your content, when you structure your content, when you maintain your content, you can look at maintaining your brand value in all languages, in any languages. The content is what defines it. The source quality is what defines it. That will allow you to then establish proper localization processes and adopt proper localization technology in order to ensure that your brand value is being maintained. It is vital, more than vital, to consider contextualizing your localization data. Linguists need to see context. They need to understand in all facets what they're translating. If that is not the case, you cannot expect them to produce perfect results. You cannot expect them to understand what they're translating and, of course, understand the target and produce the best possible result. This accelerates the process. It shaves off unnecessary workflow steps. It improves the quality. It potentially even lowers the costs. It is to your benefit. Continuous localization. As it stands today, we're talking about those direct integrations, the connections between systems. This will be maintained. It has to evolve further. We have to achieve higher degrees of automation than we have today. A potentially human-triggered operation can become an automated operation in the future. We already have come to a very long way. And from 10 years ago to today, there is a massive visible difference in how the entire flow goes. Continuous localization is here to stay. Continuous localization is something that is required. Bite-sized and content drops are something all the more frequent that we're seeing, and that will only continue. Without automation, we cannot in any way assume or hope that the individual people within the process, involved in the process, can maximize their creativity. We have an obligation to find ways to make their life easier. If we make their life easier, if we reduce the noise that they have to process, what we effectively achieve is that we expose that talent. We allow that talent to go in and do the best that they can in their individual role within the process. Thank you very much.